In this lesson, we are going to discuss the difference between calculated columns and measures in Power BI. This is crucial knowledge if you want to develop your skills in Power BI and the DAX language. If it's the first time you are learning about, especially measures, which are a little more complex, maybe it could sound weird or complicated, but you can rewatch, and I recommend you rewatch this lesson as many times as needed, because you really need to understand this before you can move forward and become more familiar with DAX, before you can produce useful and high performance dashboards. So come with me. Okay, let's learn by doing. Anything that I could say about calculated columns or measures would sound very abstract and difficult to visualize if I don't show you examples. So we are going to create a calculated column first, and then understand what's going on, then move forward to creating a measure, and then compare the characteristics of a measure versus a calculated column. And to create a calculated column, as we discussed in the previous lesson, when we are working with tables, we should use the table view. This is where we manage our tables. And like I said in the previous lesson, the table is represented on this list on the right-hand side panel of your screen. And this, you can see, this is a short table, and this is about employees. So I have the department name where each of the employees work, the base rate for each employee, and their first names and last names. Very simple table. And to create a calculated column, I am going to click New Column. And at this point, I want you to know that I don't want you to worry about the buttons we are clicking or the formulas we are writing. I want you to focus on the concept, and everything else will be discussed in more detail as we move forward. So I'm going to click New Column, and the formula bar is where I'm going to write my DAX code to create this new calculated column. And I'm going to run a very simple calculation. It may not, maybe it doesn't make sense in the real world. It's just a random example. What I'm going to do, I'm going to calculate the square root of the employees' base rates. So I will call this measure square root of base rate, and I will calculate it with the SQRT function, which is the DAX function for calculating square roots. And I'm calculating the square root of this column right here. So this column is coming from the employees table, and I'm going to calculate it on the base rate column. And we discussed this structure in one of the first lessons of our playlist on Power BI. Well, actually, this structure was discussed in one of the first lessons of another playlist, which is the DAX Foundations playlist. So if you don't understand the structure of a DAX formula, please refer to our DAX playlist, and we have a lesson explaining all that. Okay, but again, I don't want you to focus on the formula, but on the concept about calculated columns. And I'm going to press Enter, and now the new column, the calculated column, was immediately created. Let me just format this column, and I'm going to click the new column, and of course, this list represents this table. So of course, if you are creating new columns, new calculated columns, these new calculated columns will appear right here on the same list, because they now are part of the original table. And now you have to have it listed right here, not only here in the actual table. And I'm going to format it. I'm just going to click the comma, and now I have standardized all of the numbers in this column. But you can see that creating a calculated column is easy. If you watched our course on Power Query Foundations, during that course, we created a number of calculated columns during our examples and our study of Power Query. And we're doing the same thing here in Power BI. We can create calculated columns in Power BI. We can do it in Power Query. If you're importing data directly from a database, you can use the SQL language to create calculated columns. So calculated columns are easier to work, and it's not something new. It's very standard through all programming and business intelligence languages. And there's a number of observations I want you to make based on this example we just did. Hey, a lot of people watch my videos, learn a bunch, but forget to hit the like button or subscribe to the channel. If you've made it this far, it means the content helped you somehow. So go ahead and give it a like and hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep creating free content like this, and it also tells YouTube to show you more videos like this one. It's quick and it makes a big difference. Thanks. You can see that in a calculated column, the calculations are mostly horizontal calculations. It's not always the case. There are exceptions, but most times calculated columns will return horizontal calculations or iterating calculations. If you're not familiar with the concept of iteration and grouping and aggregation, please watch our Power Query Foundations playlist, because these are also concepts that you absolutely need to understand if you want to develop in Power BI and DAX. You can see that I'm calculating the square root of the base of the values and the base rate column. So I am calculating the square root for this value, and the result is here. So the square root of this value will go here. So you can see that each of these values in the calculated column, each of the rows in the calculated column correspond to the square root of the same value in the same row of the base rate column. So pretty much what we have here are horizontal calculations. Like I said, there are exceptions. For example, I could run a vertical calculations. For example, let me create a new column. It's a new calculated column, and I'm going to call it average. And what I want here, I want to calculate the average base rate. So I'm going to calculate the average base rate, and when I press enter, I will create a new measure. Average is the new measure. Let me just standardize the numbers, and you can see that now I have the same number repeated in each row. And why does this happen? Because now I created a vertical calculation. It was a calculation that was conducted vertically. I'm calculating the average of all the base rate values across the base rate column. And as this is a vertical calculation, the result that is returned is an aggregation, and an aggregation will return me a scalar value. Again, we discussed all of these concepts in the Power Query Foundations course. And of course, as I have just one average for the entire column, there's no way I can show a different number in different rows of the new calculated column. Of course, if I have just one scalar value, the average is the same for the entire base rate column. So this same number has to be repeated in each row. It's the same number, same value in each row. This is what happens when I try to run a vertical calculation to create a new calculated column. And that's why I say that mostly in most situations, for calculated columns, you will be running horizontal calculations. And of course, running vertical calculations could be useful. It could be useful. For example, maybe I want to calculate the difference between each of the base rates and the overall average. In this case, yes, it makes sense to me to create a new column. And in this new column, I can calculate the differences. This will be the differences between the overall average, which was conducted vertically, minus the base rate from each row. So I could run base rate minus average. And now you can calculate the differences. So you're calculating each base rate in each row minus the overall average, which is the same for each row. So it could make sense to run vertical calculations for calculated columns, but most times I would say you would be running row by row calculations, horizontal calculations, or iterating calculations for calculated columns creation. And like I said, these horizontal calculations, they will be repeated in each row. So the same horizontal calculation will be taking place in each row. And you can see that new columns, calculated columns, they are fixed. They are fixed and they are physically stored. They do not adapt to visuals. What does that mean? You saw that whenever we create a new calculated column, this calculated column will immediately take the same shape as the table. Of course, you're working with the table, so there's no way you can create a calculated column and have it horizontally or a diagonal or as a circle or a square or anything. So the only way you can visualize a new calculated column is this in the same shape, in the same form, in the same format as the original table. There's no other way. It's different from a measure, as we will see in a bit. So this is why calculated columns are fixed, and the value calculated in calculated columns, it doesn't change. Unless, of course, if you change your source data, if you change your original table, if these base rates will change and you update your table, your data model, of course, so the calculation will be updated and the numbers will change. But actually, the numbers only will change if you change your source data. If not, so your calculated columns will always show the same values. Or, of course, if you change the DAX formula. Okay, but these all require your action. It's not calculated real time. It's only calculated at the time you write your DAX functions and press enter, or if you change your source data and update your data source. Okay, but rule of thumb, calculated columns do not change. They are fixed and they are physical. I'm calling it physical columns because they will be listed on this list on your data table. And that means that you can use calculated columns, and we have seen that happen because we first created the square root of base rate, then we calculated differences, and well, we calculated the average, and then the average column was used in to calculate the differences column. So you can see that I created a calculated column, and then I use a calculated column to create another calculated column. So each calculated column is stored and listed on your data panel, and you can reuse it. So that's why I'm calling it a physical column. And this is to differentiate this kind of column from virtual columns and virtual tables. We will see later on what virtual tables are. Virtual tables are tables that you create within DAX measures, and you cannot see them. When you create a virtual table and a DAX formula, you can't see them right here. You can't see them anywhere. So these virtual tables are not physical, and you cannot use a virtual table in a different measure or in a different calculated column. Virtual tables only can be used within a single DAX formula or set of DAX formulas. And that's why I'm calling these calculated columns of physical columns, because they can be reused for other purposes while the virtual ones cannot. Don't worry about it. We will have at least 2 or 3 lessons specifically on virtual tables. This is a more advanced topics that we will see in the DAX language course. Okay. And as you can see, when we create a new calculated column, you will see the calculated column instantly. You don't need a visual, so you can visualize what you just created. It's different with the measure. A measure cannot be seen instantly. You need something else to actually see the result of the measures. We'll see that in a bit, but as you just saw, the calculated column appears instantly in the table. And like I already said, calculated column are calculated once and only recalculated when data is refreshed and your source data is changed. One of the reasons to create calculated columns is to use them in measures. Like I said, as we have the calculated columns as physical columns, we can reuse it to create new calculated measures or new calculated columns, or to use them in measures. So calculated columns are very useful to create data, to create information that you need to calculate measures that you are going to use in your visuals. And we will see examples of that. And like I said, calculated measures are not something new. They can be calculated in Power Query, SQL, or any other programming language. I already said that can be used for calculating new calculated columns. There you go, and that's it about calculated columns. And let's move forward to measures. Let's create, okay, I'm going to delete these calculated columns just to clean up our data model. You already understood how to work with calculated columns. And now, like at the same way as we discussed in the previous lesson, the same way you cannot work with tables in the report view when you work in the table view, you cannot work with visuals, right? So we have to go back to the report view so we can work with visuals. And when we talk about measures, we are automatically talking about visuals because measures have all to do with visuals. The main difference, I would say the main difference between measures and calculated columns is that measures do not have a fixed shape or a fixed format. Measures are calculated real time, and the way you see your measures will depend on the context of your visuals and the context of your filters. So differently from calculated columns that are calculated and appear immediately, measures do not appear immediately. And the way it looks to you, the way it appears to you, will depend on the context of the visual. Let's see how that works in practice. I'm going to create a new measure, and the measure here, what I want to do, I actually want to, let's say I want the average. Again, I want the average of the entire base rate column for us. And the report view, I can't see the entire column. I can only see the representation of the column on the list on the data panel. So to create a new measure, I'm going to right click the employees table name and select new measure. And now I'm going to create a new measure that I'm going to call it average. I'm going to call it measure one. Okay, measure one. You can call it whatever you want. And what I want to do, I want the average again of the base rate column. Okay, and there you go. As you can see, I just created the measure, and I know the measure is right here. It's also listed on your data pane, but hey, I don't see any numbers, right? I don't see any numbers. When you created your calculated column, you pressed enter, so the calculated column was created immediately. And you could see the results of the table immediately. But now you created your measure and you can see no numbers. And that's the point. That's the main measure. A measure doesn't have a specific or fixed format. It depends on your context. And this is why I have here 3 different visuals. I have a bar chart and a card and a table. And you will see that if I bring my measure to one of these visuals, it will be shown one way. And if I bring it over to another visual, at this moment, they are the same. You can see the same number. Let me bring it over to the bar chart and you can see the same number, right? Let me just standardize it. So we have the same number in each visual. And at this point, the overall average is 18.19. It's the same number in each of the visuals. Okay, but the first point, you saw that we couldn't see any result before we inserted the measure into one of these visuals. Okay, and let's use our slicers here on top. And here on top, I have the company departments. And if I click engineering, now my measure will be recalculated immediately because now it's only calculating the average. Look, in the table, we first calculated the average for the entire table, for the entire column. But this column corresponds to many departments: production and engineering, executive, finance, human resources, marketing, production, and so on. So the overall average covers all of the departments. But in a measure, when I select only engineering, Power BI will filter down and remove all departments but engineering. So it's like you are creating a new average based on this filtered table. And if I change it to, for example, production, now it recalculates real time a new average for the rows that correspond to production. Like this, what the measure is doing, it's filtering down, it's removing everything else but production. And now the average it's calculating is based only on the base rates that correspond to production. Let me clear all filters. And that's why we say that a measure corresponds to your current context. So now the context of my visuals is that we are filtering only the employees in the production department or marketing department. And every time I change my slicers, my measure will be recalculated real time. And not only that, let me select all of the departments again. Not only that, look, in a table, I can have more information, right? I can, for example, let me bring into my table, let me bring the department name. And now what I just did, let me bring department on top. And what I did here, I just forced my table to show each of the departments. And as I forced the visual to display all of the departments, the measure was forced to recalculate the average department by department. This is called grouping, as we studied in our Power Query Foundations course. Furthermore, I can bring into the table, I can bring, for example, the first name. Let me just reorganize it. Let's bring first name on top of the measure. And now again, I forced the visual to show all of the departments and all of the employees in each department, and the measure was recalculated. Now I only have the average for each employee from each department. So this is, you can see that I have different numbers here and here, but the measure that I used in both visuals is just exactly the same. The same measure is showing you different results, different calculations, because a measure will adjust, will adapt to the context of each visual and each filter. And again, if I, for example, select production, you can see that now the table only has production, or sales. Now the table only has employees from sales, and the values are recalculated accordingly. Same thing here. Using the bar charts, let me bring to the bar chart, I will bring the department name. And again, it's giving me the average base rate for each department. And I can also bring the first name to the y-axis. And now I have two levels of information. And if I click these two arrows, I can change from average salary by department to average salary by employee. And you can see that there's a lot that I can do instead of calculating, of running a different calculation for each visual. I can use only one single measure and have it show different values according to the context of each visual. And again, I can keep filtering human resources or quality assurance or executive. And this is the magic of measure. And now let's see the observations we made working with measures. Measures are not physically stored, and they adapt to the context of the visuals differently from calculated columns. They are recalculated real time at each slicer interactions. We just saw it. And the last step when you are calculating a measure is typically an aggregation. Measures are all about aggregation. We are going to discuss more details as we learn virtual tables. When you're creating virtual tables, actually, you cannot create measures with DAX table functions. And in the DAX language, there are functions that are used exclusively for working with tables, and you can't use those in DAX unless you end up creating a final aggregation function. And we will learn all of these details later on. Don't worry about it at this point. Just know that measures are ultimately created for aggregation. Like I said, it depends on the visual to be seen. When you create a measure, unless you put it in that visual, you can't see the result of the calculations. The same measure can be used in multiple visuals, and most importantly, it can show different values according to the context of each visual. And no, they cannot be created in Power Query or SQL. So measures are a powerful tool that you can find in Power BI, but you won't find in every programming language or every tool in the market. And of course, measures can be used to calculate new measures. Okay, so these are the main differences between working with calculated columns and measures. If it sounds weird, if you did not understand all of the details, please rewatch this video, because this will make a difference and help you develop your Power BI and DAX skills moving forward. Please don't forget to hit that like button. That is so important to us. That keeps us motivated to produce more of this kind of content and help more people develop their professional skills and excel in the market. See you in the next lesson.